a kiss goodbye and put the sun back in the sky. And when he comes calling, you're not falling. Shout hooray and howling. Now me and Mr.
Hello, Confidant community, high earning community. Welcome to the High Earning Women podcast.
Forget about the boy. Forget about the boy. Forget about the boy.
I hope you're enjoying this. I'd love to know you if you even know this song. Feel free to let me know. So right now we're listening to the sounds of Veronica Swift from the album Confessions. And I'm Jackie Porter, podcast host, music lover, and pretend DJ. And the song is Forget About the Boy, in case you didn't know it. She's just so awesome and fun, this one. Have you heard this before? I would love to know. So I hope you were enjoying grooving to that song. I just love this song. It's just such a fun, nostalgic song to me. And as I mentioned, the song is called Forget About the Boy. And if you are someone that's separating from your partner, if you're a woman separating from her partner, not so easy to do, Confidant community, especially once you've said those key words, I do, right? Or even if you've decided to move in together. Unfortunately, the later in life that you say I do, or even move in together, separating becomes more and more a personal and financial heartbreak. How many of you could relate to that? Anyway, I heard a quote lately that I think aptly sums up separating later in life. And it kind of goes like this. When you get married early in life, it's like two startups coming together. Marrying later in life looks more like a merger, right? This means there's really a lot more at stake when the relationship unravels. So I just wanted to put that out there. Again, welcome to the High Earning Women podcast. In case you've never tuned into us before, our mission is about making financial conversations accessible, just so that high earning women can make confident financial decisions and live the life they deserve. And I'm Jackie Porter. And again, for those of you who haven't tuned into me before, I love connecting music with our theme. And of course, our podcast today, we're going to be diving into a topic that's both challenging and very crucial, which is navigating divorce as a high earning executive or a business owner. And that means whether you're managing a business, leading a team, excelling in your career, there's a lot of complexities associated with separating, and it can feel pretty overwhelming. But I'm here to say you deserve to live the life you've built on your own terms, and understanding the legal and financial aspects of separating is crucial. So joining me today, she's been here in the background, is Heather Hansen, and she's a partner at McCarthy Hansen, and she's also a renowned family lawyer that specializes in helping high-earning women and executives through divorce. So Heather, welcome to the podcast. Have you ever heard that song before?
No, that was the first time for me.
Hope you liked it.
Yeah, I did. It was great.
Yes, I love jazzy music, and I really wanted to dig into really the song by Veronica Swift, because, you know, what she talked about just at the start of our podcast is, can we simply afford to forget about the boy, as she says? I suspect not.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the concept of separation, people sort of idealistically see it as a finite thing, but for more people than not, it's not a finite. It's really what I like to describe to people, particularly people in a higher net worth situation, is that this is an unwinding, and unwindings don't happen automatically. It's not a flick of a switch. And people will spend decades building wealth and building a relationship with each other, and sometimes it takes time to unwind the complexities of that. And of course, the more complex the structures that have been put in place, often for very legitimate tax or estate or commercial planning, that adds a layer of complexity as well. So no, it's not as easy as the
Yep.
song suggests to say goodbye.
Boy, bye. This is what I know my clients would love to do.
Not quite as simple, no, for sure.
Well, let's start with the basics, because
Sure.
divorce can be truly overwhelming for high earning women. Obviously, as you said, the stakes are higher. That merger and that unraveling of the merger there's so many headwinds, right? So let's talk about what some of those unique challenges are when you see high earning women looking to separate from their partners.
Sure. I'd like to start by just sort of like situating where, like, for many of your listeners, just as a moment and a reminder, where a high income woman sits actually in society, because it does connect to some of the challenges that
Totally.
that exist through the separation process. So, and I also will just say at the beginning, like, I am speaking from a perspective that is gendered. I speak plainly and in gendered language because in my practice, it represents what I see. And what I see in the most cases are heteronormative relationships, a man and a woman who come together, and this is the reality, and it continues to be the reality. I've been doing this for almost 20 years. Division of labor still exists, and
Yes.
income disparity still exists, and roles where that reality still exists makes a high income earning woman usually a unicorn, if you will. Okay, so it's already a unique position, and I do say that and speak with authority on that. If 100 clients come into my office, I will see 10 where there's even income parity, let alone the female of the hetero relationship out earning. It is an anomaly. Okay, so when we're talking about unwinding, the dynamics of the relationship usually are already different than what most of society is used to. And we talk about this in a way as if that doesn't exist, but I see it in my practice. So high income women continue to be already in a unique position. And often that creates really complex power imbalances, actually, because unlike in traditional relationships where the higher income spouse is the male, division of labor roles actually don't necessarily coincide with income. And
no, they don't.
So, what I like to say, and it's a little bit sort of crass and plain, but one of the benefits of being a high income man in a marriage with a stay-at-home or a lower incoming female spouse is you get the benefits of the birthday presents and the turkey dinners and the house being kept and all of those stereotypes that make people uncomfortable, but they are still existing, that traditionally a woman who stays home or is a lower income earner takes on a disproportionate share of the domestic responsibilities to the benefit of the higher income spouse. And what I see, and so therefore what I know after 20 years is that dynamic doesn't actually hardly ever exist for a higher income earning woman. They often do both. So they're a CEO outside, and then they continue to be a CEO inside the home, taking on many of what we hear and talk about as like the mental load of parenting and the relationship. So you may very well have divided labor in terms of the physicality of, you may have a stay-at-home spouse who's a man who does things and is an amazing contributor. But the dynamic is still really quite unique, often for a high income earning spouse who is a woman. So that's like the first thing to just.
No, and that's a huge thing, because
Right.
I want to dig into that a little bit, because I think that a lot of women who I see in my practice are just what you've described is
Right.
common. So their income would actually be higher if you didn't factor in
Right.
all the thing they do for free, right?
Right. Exactly. And so, they're already, so when people separate, right. And I'll talk about this through the lens of somebody who's a high income earner who still has childcare responsibilities. And I can talk about it in sort of what we call the graying divorce or separation with someone who's at a stage where they're not having those responsibilities.
Right.
But in the former category, when people separate, we unwind parenting issues, we unwind division of property, and then we deal with support, both child and spousal support.
Right.
And so, high income earning women who are also in a caregiving role to children often face really unfortunate stereotypes about their roles that are really gendered, right? So she can't possibly be a primary caregiver because she travels to Brazil 3 times a month. So that can't be. Or he's a stay-at-home father, but he's not, or whatever. And so we see those sort of like just off the bat, before you even get into the nitty-gritty of the financial, you see sort of really like sort of unfair archetypes and stereotypes sort of pushed on women in this position. So that's like the first challenge. The second challenge, and then I can talk about some of the legal challenges,
right.
Is that, and this is gender neutral, right? But this is another reality, is that if you're in a high income or a high responsibility role in your professional life, divorce is one of the great life crises, right? So death and divorce, the loss of a job or the loss of a family member, those are the traumas. We can count on one hand the types of traumas that are sort of profound in someone's life. And when you hold a job that has high performance and high expectations, often people in that environment don't take time to really recognize the impact of the separation on their ability to do their job. I like to use a surgeon as an example, right? Like someone who literally is putting someone on the table and trying to keep them alive during the day. They don't take time to think about the consequences. So those are sort of the softer impacts. Do you want me to talk about the legal stuff?
Yeah, I do. And I wanted to just, when you mentioned, the gender roles that plague high earning women, because they're in such a unique scenario. They're not the typical high earning person that you're seeing. And that's one of the reasons I did the podcast. There's just not enough being written about women who are breadwinners and who are the high earning income. And I almost feel like they need their own little support group. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we don't talk about the experience they have enough, and it's so unique. And so you're saying, listen, these are people who are still dealing with gendered stereotypes, and they form such a small group of people. And so that's the first, I'd say, common misconception, is their situation is so not linear, right? And then the second I'm hearing is, as they deal with the separation, that there's not enough thought around the impact of the separation emotionally and how it might impact their work moving forward, is the two things I'm catching from this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the second one isn't particular to women, right? It's like but I do think that there's a very direct correlation. Again, one of the things I like the most about my job is I just every day get to examine the human condition. So
yes. Same here.
And it's like you get to understand why people do things and what informs people. And, there's such a direct correlation between high performing professionals and also like extremely high resilience, often to a fault, right? Like inability to.
That's a good point.
Right. And so, if you're a great taskmaster, you often don't sort of take a step back and recognize the toll on your body and your mind of whatever it is, you just plow through. And so, and like, I'm sure many of us, I'm guilty of that.
Me too. As you say that, I'm like, oh my goodness, I have to re-examine my own self.
Right. And so, and it's really hard to do. But again, in the classic example is I'll sit in a meeting with someone, I'll go through their financial statement, I'll talk to them about the financial issues in the case. And then at the end of the meeting, I'll say, are you seeing a therapist? And they'll say, I don't have time to see a therapist.
That's
and
right.
Like, well, okay. So like that, and that's I don't need to, or I don't have time. And so it's again, that piece isn't gendered, but it definitely is it's compounded when women who are high income earners are pushing up against the stereotyping and the unique place that they sit in the separation process. So it's a compounding problem that I see more for women in my practice, for sure.
Yeah, as you said, it's kind of like all of the additional expectations. I'd say societal expectations, gender role expectations that are still plaguing them, because they're, at the end of the day, society still expects so much from them, even as a high earner, that they don't expect from men, that they'd have to think about. And because they're so resilient, they may not necessarily know that they need support, because I find that women in those scenarios often think if they need help, they might be failing in some way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then that's part of the resilience building that they've spent, like how they've survived their career, right? Is to be, we confuse resilience isn't always positive. I mean, most of the times it is, but it's not always a positive thing when especially if you're in the middle of a traumatic moment in your life, for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about that, all of that weight that they're carrying. How does that impact negotiations if they're the primary breadwinner with all of these things that they're facing, the gender biases and the gender role expectations, and then all this stress that they don't even process yet, that they need support for?
Well, the negotiation process for, I don't see in the, and I think part of it is because I come from the perspective that I'm a lawyer, and I also am a lawyer I have a litigation practice and a litigation gaze. And that doesn't mean I don't settle cases. I settle a ton more cases than I litigate, and I have a very large litigation practice, but I don't see and experience sort of the challenges in the negotiation process, because the very nature of having counsel, I think that, it's not so much about the negotiation itself, if they're properly supported, which is when by the time they get to me, they're properly supported. I think the challenge for many high income earners is that it's very difficult to find the time to make the decision to move forward with the separation process. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult when you come and meet with me and I tell them the harsh reality of what the consequences financially will be of the separation. It is, and I'll speak to that, I'm sure, it disproportionately is difficult for women who are high income earners, very challenging. And then that often makes them pause or disengage, right? And that, I think, is the bigger challenge, is that how do I find time for this? The reality is also, and again, this is my observation. I'm obviously not saying this is the experience across the board. And I do practice in an area of higher net worth. But more often than not, when I do not remember in my practice, the time where I have seen two full-time working professionals with income parity within sort of 10% of each other, with similar professional jobs and backgrounds. You might see two doctors who are married to each other, but one of them works part-time and earns 150, and the other one is a surgeon who earns 850, right? So the veneer of two professionals, behind the surface. And for the higher income earning woman, when they're in that position, it's not uncommon that the lower income earning spouse has either left a career for reasons, maybe childcare, but maybe also mental health, or maybe addiction,
True.
maybe other reasons, right? I would say that the sample size of high income earning women with spouses who are not working is disproportionately higher, that there's a reason they've not been successful in their career. They can't hold down a job. They have this added layer. It's not, I am a man who earns $500,000 a year, and my wife, who was a nurse, chose to stay home to raise the children, and everything's that's not what it is more often than not. So they often have this compounding issue, which also sometimes engages domestic violence, sometimes engages all sorts of things that are behind closed doors, right? Because of the complexities of whatever's going on in the home. So I do see those things more with higher income women. And that, again, is a reluctance to engage. And that's why it's not so much about the negotiation. I always say to people, the hardest part of a family law case, hardest part is the first part. It's the picking up the phone. It's the talking to the lawyer. It's the actual separation, it's those first couple of months, right? Like I talk to my clients more in the first sort of 10% of the case and in the last 10% of the case than I do throughout the whole process, because it's such a sensitive and sometimes like dangerous and unstable time. So that's the challenge that I do think actually exists more for higher income women that we don't talk about enough, that there's often things underlying the dynamic and the relationship that are challenging for them to choose to engage in the separation process.
So choosing to engage sounds like making the decision that I want to separate is probably the part that takes the longest. That is wrought with all kinds of complex reasons behind it, is what it sounds like to me. And that when they finally decide that they're gonna contact you, that doesn't mean they'll go through it, but that whole process of deciding, there might be financial reasons, there might be emotional reasons that they don't necessarily go through with it.
For sure. Yeah. It's really common that I'll see somebody and then I'll say to them, there's no right way of doing this, and I won't see them again for 6 months, and then they'll come back in 6 months, and then, you know, we're having the same. And that, like, I'm, again, one of the features of being a divorce lawyer is you're extremely judgment free, right? So never works for you because you have to meet people where they are, right, in life.
Indeed. I mean, I see that in my own practice with people deciding to deal with their finances. They might go through that same process for similar and different reasons, right? Mm-hmm. Now let's talk a little bit about the money part, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's often the center of these discussions as well. What does financial transparency look like? And what should higher earning women be doing to prepare for a separation, especially if it takes them this long to get to the point to decide?
Yeah, so I'll just give like a sort of the 3-minute primer on the entire body of law that I practice on the financial issues. But so generally speaking, and I'll speak through the perspective of married, not unmarried partners at this point. Okay. But if you're married in this province and you separate, then the relationship is a civil relationship in the sense that it's not like we have a set of rules and laws that govern the relationships, but it's not you versus the state. It's not like your obligation to pay income taxes or comply with the criminal law. So parties can and do reach agreements that are different than the law, but we use the law as sort of the starting point of the framework. And the law around how we divide property is that when you're married, there is no such thing as a community of property. So there's no such thing as joint ownership by virtue of marriage. It's a common misconception. Okay. So the first thing we do is we find the universe of assets. And to do that, first we determine title. So if you own something, it's your asset. If your spouse owns something, it's their asset. That is very, very important for many people because, for example, if you're an owner operator of a privately held corporation and you're a shareholder and you're worried that now because you're married, your spouse has an interest in your business, they do not. Your business has a value, and then that value will get included in your net worth. Once we've determined who owns what, and then, I spend a lot of my time in my practice talking about value, like what are the value of the things. If it's a house, it's easy. If it's a 1/3 interest in a software company, it's hard, right? So value is not a defined term in our legislation, so it depends on the person.
So it's relative.
Yeah, and it really depends on the asset. And so once we've determined, have we captured all the assets? Who owns the assets? How much are the assets worth? Then we look at the difference of the net worths between the parties, and subject to a couple of exclusions that we can talk about later, maybe. We calculate our net worth, and if I'm worth $10 and my spouse is worth $5, I owe a payment to equalize our net worths. That's what it is, okay? And so that sounds easy because it was designed to be easy. It was designed for a T4 teacher and a T4 nurse who owned a home and a pension. And when we separate, all we have to do is total those very clear assets up. But of course, the more complex your assets, the more uncertain value is, right? Like in terms of the types of enterprise you're in, and value for things like stock options, deferred compensation, for if you're a shareholder of a privately held corporation, if you're a shareholder of a startup, if you're an owner operator of something that's about to go public, if there's an offer to purchase out there of one of your entities, right? So Those kind of questions can be really complicated. So that's the first piece in terms of what can women do to prepare if they're going through a separation. Again, there are many people in this province, I would say most people actually, who can go through the process of separation in a very simple, straightforward way, sometimes using a mediator, sometimes doing it by themselves, right? There's lots of really good tools out there, but no different than high net worth people needing the assistance of financial planners.
Right.
The thing that a higher net worth person needs as part of their separation is to talk to someone like me to make a strategic plan. Because when we're talking about things like value, that also includes disclosure, because we got to show the other.
That's what I was going to ask about, transparency. Right?
So if you're in a commercially sensitive environment where the production of information could be taken by competitors, or you're worried about the consequences of sharing information for a bunch of very valid commercial reasons, that's part of your family law dynamic, right? So you need to have a lawyer to talk and help navigate that with you. There's a couple of touch points about like during marriages, what people should be mindful of. Okay. And so I'll give you like the top three. So the first is that title governs, right? So, people will often meet with financial planners, estate planners, tax practitioners, and they will make decisions about what they're doing with assets during their marriage, often for very good planning reasons. But if you take an asset and you put it in your spouse's name, or if you choose to hold an asset jointly with the spouse, that means that asset is jointly held. When in doubt, hold things yourself, okay? The other thing, which I see so often, especially with higher income women, and sometimes these are the circumstances where you actually do see people who are in like a parity position or they've got equality, is when they're joint shareholders of a business, right? And so if you're joint shareholders of a business and you're married, okay, if you're genuinely owning and operating the business as joint shareholders, then you should have a separate shareholders agreement that deals with, and a domestic contract that deals with dissolution. But if you are like the shareholder and your spouse is just a shareholder in title, right? Like just for formality or to issue dividends or whatever, you have to think of the consequences of that. They're an owner, right? They have shareholder rights. They have shareholder rights that are not just about their interest as a spouse. So really being cognizant, and depending on your net worth and depending on the assets, considering talking to a family law practitioner alongside some of the planning that people do. And then the last one that I do see, unfortunately, and this is particularly relevant for some of your older listeners or people who are in that gray divorce zone.
Right.
It is impossible to get to a certain point of net worth without there being a discussion with an estate practitioner about whether you should be putting things in trusts or doing estate planning that involves, for example, estate freezes to plan for intergenerational wealth transfer. It's a very common, completely appropriate conversation as part of estate planning. But when you put something in a trust, okay, you are giving the thing away. When your spouse asks you to put something in a trust, the consequence of that in family law can be significant. So you got to really like think about that if you're, and people, and it's a hard conversation to have. It's
challenging. It's really very challenging
because people are like, after the fact, that, right? So it's very hard. And it is really important for people who are listening, who are providing advice, that they, get comfortable being uncomfortable with your clients and saying, okay, so let's have a really uncomfortable conversation about what happens if this relationship breaks up. And they can decline to engage with that issue, of course. But as practitioners, we should be pretty comfortable saying to them, have you thought about it? Because those three things in particular, right? Like, be careful how you own things. Be careful if you're in business with your spouse, and be really, really careful if you're going to give something away. Those are really significant issues that during the course of your marriage, you should think about if you're the higher income or the asset controlling spouse in your marriage.
No, I really appreciate you saying that again. So Confidant community, are you listening to this? What do you really want to have the asset joint is what I'm hearing. Do you really want to add your spouse as a shareholder on your company, ladies? It might sound like a good tax planning strategy, but is it a good in like protecting your asset strategy? because these are relationships different when they're new, might be different when they get older. And what I'm hearing from you around gray divorce people is be careful for giving the money away and putting it into a trust for your spouse, because that means they have different rights to that asset, which might sound good from a planning perspective, but not necessarily good from a unraveling your marriage perspective.
Yeah, they can have significant consequences. And again, it's this podcast. I could talk for literally a week around.
I feel like I'm going to have you back, Heather, because I feel like we're just starting to dig into the meat of things.
The trust, and it is, the decision making, and the one that we see even more often with a going concern business when we're talking, everyone, we talk about the great wealth transfer, right? We're right smack in the middle of the great wealth transfer.
Right, we are.
And we are seeing the benefits of this intergenerational wealth transfer happening. We're also seeing the consequences of it. And some of these instruments, right, we see estate freezes where the parents hold on to the preference shares of the business, and then the common shares are gifted to children through some sort of structure, maybe a trust.
Right.
And maybe that's done when everyone's 62 years old, and then they're separating when they're 75. And there's $10 million of growth in those common shares that were gifted away to the children without the spouse really understanding the consequences of that. And they've been living on the redemption of their preference shares. And so their marriage ends, and they're like, but I have nothing because it's all in the trust. And so there's tons of legal disputes around those issues right now. We're seeing a lot of that. But again,
what I'm hearing is that's why you really need to have those uncomfortable conversations to talk about best and worst case scenario planning, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. I think about all of this, and I just recognize that going back to those sweet years, the happy early years of the marriage, which might be a year or 6 months, or it could be 10, 15, 20 years if you're a gray divorce somebody. It just talks through the fact that divorce isn't just a legal and financial process. It's very emotional as well. Mm-hmm. There's a quote I heard recently as well. It was a really great quote that says, you marry with your heart, but you divorce with your mind. Right?
Yes.
So, what advice do you have for women trying to balance emotional well-being while staying focused on all of the financial aspects they have to think about when they marry?
Well, when they marry, so at the front end of the relationship, when you're considering entering into a marriage with net worth, there are things that can be done to again, I would say at the front end, the number one thing is you have to be comfortable having these conversations, and that burden is amplified. It's very romantic when two people marry and they're first year law students with $50,000 of debt each and a used car. That's very, that's the very traditional idea of starting a partnership and starting an economic partnership. But if you're coming into a marriage where you're a wealth holder, right? We do have tools to do some protection. And the most common tool we have is what's called a marriage contract, otherwise known as a prenup. We call them domestic contracts because under our legislation, that's what they're referred to.
Right.
And domestic contracts can do all sorts of things. They can say what's yours is yours and what's mine is mine. Those are really anomalous types of contracts. They're more suitable to people who are each independently wealthy and where there's a reasonable certainty that there will be no economic dependence between them. So sometimes that makes sense. I would say that's sort of the minority, or for people, again, later in life who are having a second or third marriage and they want to make sure that their children or their broader estate takes priority over the financial issues of their spouse.
Right.
So those are sometimes. The more common one that we see is what's called a class of excluded assets. And what that is that we identify a group of assets, or sometimes a single asset, sometimes it's a business, sometimes it's an interest in an investment account, sometimes it's an interest in a trust. And we say for all time that asset and its growth sometimes will be excluded. So we're carved something out, right? And those can be very simple. They can be very hard, depending on what you're trying to exclude and what you're trying to keep in. And again, when I talk about exclude and keep in, I'm talking about this formula called equalization of net family property. So when we're doing the math of whether I'm worth $10 or $4, I can have a contract that says, even though I'm worth $10, this one thing worth $3 will never form part of what I share with you. So therefore, I'm only ever going to share $7 with you. Okay. So that's the contract that you can have.
I love that.
Simply understood. Yeah. And then the other one, the hot tip that I will give to your listeners, which is I'll tell you the number one upsetting thing that happens to people, which is misinformation in our public sphere. Okay. So you ready?
Tell me more.
So, in Ontario, when we're calculating net worth, we only calculate the value of assets accumulated during the marriage. Okay. Subject to some exclusions, the biggest exclusion being if you received a gift or inheritance during a marriage. So that's carved out. Okay. But when we talk about that, because we're only calculating the growth, if you come into the marriage with assets, that value is not shared on the date of separation. So if I come into the marriage with $10, my net worth grows by another $10. And then at the end of the marriage, even though I'm worth $20, I only share the 10 that's the growth. Okay, that's the concept. It's called a date of marriage deduction. Okay. Right. And so for many people, they think, okay, great. Well, I know what my net worth is on the date of marriage. I have this date of marriage deduction, no problem. Except, so the matrimonial home, which for many people, okay, is one of their largest assets.
Right.
The matrimonial home, by definition, is the home that you and your spouse occupy ordinarily during the marriage and at the time of separation. And you can have more than one matrimonial home. So if you have a cottage, that can be a mat home too. So the matrimonial home has special treatment in law. And what it is that you are not entitled to assert an exclusion or a date of marriage deduction over a mat home. So I'll explain the operation of that. So I get married. I have a condo that I've paid off because I've worked my tail off, and I have a mortgage-free condo. And I meet my guy and we fall in love and he moves in and we get married and we live in that condo. And then on the date of separation, the condo is worth $1.2 million, but he had an affair 3 years into the marriage and we've only been married 3 years. Okay. Let's use 6 years as a bit of a better example. Okay. Right. That thing is net family property. You have lost your date of marriage deduction. So you've lost your deduction, you've lost your exclusion. And for many young professionals, the first thing they do is they try to pay down their home. So that is the number one that I see, like for high income women in their 30s or their 40s who are like, I met a guy, he's going to move into my condo or he's going to move into my house. They need a marriage contract.
Not so fast.
That's what you're saying. A contract that excludes, that makes the matrimonial home an exclusion. So they get that protection because the law treats the matrimonial home as an asset that should otherwise be shared. So it's, that's one where people get burned badly.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a huge one because first of all, the women I deal with, and I think that's across the board because I'm seeing people coming out of a marriage with debt, like with mortgage debt. And so that was always their first thing to pay off, like get rid of the debt, get rid of the mortgage debt. And so, yeah. And that's probably, their cottage, their home, the two big assets, as you said, that they have in the marriage, but they don't realize, and I didn't realize that it does, would be treated differently. So you saying both would be the home and the cottage could be considered? If
you bring a home, the very, very simple way of understanding it is if you bring something into the marriage that you're going to live in with your spouse, you lose that thing if you break up without a contract. That's me distilling all the law into a sentence.
Right.
So don't do that.
Wow.
You have a contract. Yeah.
Honestly, Heather, I feel like you're going to have to come back because I feel like we're just digging into so much between all of the misogyny from being a woman, like just dealing with all of the gender issues that women have to deal with, still working in the home and working outside of the home. So making the bacon and bringing it home and frying up the bacon. It's just like, and then trying to figure out
how to even talk about
after divorce, right?
Yeah. And spousal support is the next piece, which is even harder for higher income women. And can be horribly challenging for them. Yeah.
So I feel like you're going to have to come back where we talk about the support piece, because it's a huge piece that I think women don't fully understand. And, you know, like I said, we love, and when we make a decision to marry, it tends to be an emotional decision, but then we divorce on the mental side. So the whole idea of being proactive, having a prenup, a postnup, to really think through the mental piece of this, so that it's less financial heartbreak. Of course, heartbreak is heartbreak, but financial heartbreak doesn't have to be as hurtful if you've sort of thought these things through. You know, I have a couple of questions before we wrap up, and I definitely do want to have you back, because I feel like we could talk about any of these issues for long periods of time. What are some calls to action that you'd want to pass on to high-earning women going through a divorce?
Well, I mean, I am by nature, as a product of the work I do, I am an optimist. Like, I do think that life, that we all can live a beautiful life in whatever form, and challenge and pain and heartache is actually part of a beautiful life. You know, we are living longer than ever. I'm 44. I do think 44 is the new 24. Like, I think we are, you know, I do think that women are having a bit of a renaissance in terms of our sense of self and our abilities. And I do think that part of us sort of navigating what it means to be, you know, a woman who cares about earning money, cares about having a family, cares about their own gender identity, all of those things, you know, needs to play a bit of a long game. And, you know, so in terms of a call to action, life exists in phases. There's seasons of life. You know, I say to people, you know, we used to think of divorce as like particularly for women, we used to think of divorce as being like a sign of failure, right? My marriage failed. My marriage was a failure, right? Actually, you know, when people are living to 100 and people are working until 75, and we have career mobility and we have podcasts and we have a connected world in a way that we did not before, life is seasons, right? And life is seasons. And if we stop thinking in binary ways, and particularly for women who are high income or high achieving, you know, I live and die by a good competition, right? Like, I like to be best. We like to be best, and we like to win, and we like to be able to put a little badge on our chest and say, here's my gold star. And, you know, that's not real life, right? Like, real life is about seasons and challenges. And so, you know, if you have inertia about ending your marriage, or you're feeling like your own stuff about your personal identity is getting in the way of your like true happiness, that's not a 2025 mindset, is what I would say, right? I think that we can be a bit more pragmatic and a bit more gentle on ourselves about that. And I really encourage my clients to think about it that way. You know, one of the other things that I love about my job is I see people. I do like this concept of good people and bad people, or, you know, that it's just garbage, right? I see people at their absolute worst, and I still see them for their unique characteristics, for the things about them that are interesting, for their goodness, like the parts of them, like, right? And so, you know, we can not look at divorce and separation as either a failure or a polarizing of our relationships. And of course, there's many relationships that are toxic and dangerous and abusive. Of course, like, I'm not saying that those things don't exist, but in terms of a call to action for a woman in 2025 who's a high income, high achieving person, I'd really encourage you to think about it in the context of seasons of life, right? Like, and how do we move through life with dignity and control and autonomy over what we want? And that is actually about being gentle with who you are and what it means to be achieving in life, right? Like, actually thinking about what it means to achieve and be optimistic, and like to continue to be optimistic, and not think of a relationship ending as a failure, because I think that's really where higher achieving women in particular sell themselves short.
I couldn't agree more. And it does require a mindset shift because, as you said, you know, as you go through different parts of your life, especially because you could have had a marriage that lasted 30 years, right? Or 25 years. If you like a great divorce could be 30 years, could be 20 years. And it worked for that length of time, but you're changing, you're growing. And so you're in a different phase of life. So, you know, nobody's wrong, nobody's fault. It's just that times change, people change, and it's kind of like, okay, next, like forget about the boy, like move to the next stage. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Move to the next stage of your life and forgive yourself, let go and move forward. And I love that idea of just being optimistic about the future and, you know, turning the page and, you know, looking at what's happened, like deciding that the relationship's over. That doesn't mean that's the end. That's the end of that chapter, but not the end of the life that you want to live and the life
your identity
or your identity or the life you should feel excited about.
And the flip of that, right? The flip of that, which I also say, is that there's also no shade in committing to a lifetime with one person, right? Like, you know, people should work at their relationships, right? We're very in this sort of like this world of like instant gratification and all of those things. There's a lot of value in also really working at relationships. And I do believe that therapeutic work works. I do believe that people, you know, whether it's individually or as a couple at the right time in the right circumstances can and should do that work, right? And so, you know, I also do get people into my office where I say to them, I don't know if you should break up, right? Like, I don't know, you know, at this stage in life, if that's actually what you need, and looking for other things in your life that are fulfilling and meaningful, that aren't just about your relationship with your spouse, can actually sometimes improve your relationship with your spouse. So, you know, again, I'm a big fan of the human condition, and I'm a big fan of the messiness of life. So, you know, there's definitely no right or wrong, but I do think the takeaway for especially high income, high achieving women is like, you're not there to win a medal, right? You're there to live your life, right? And so like, just give yourself a break on what it means to be a certain thing or to look a certain way or to achieve certain things. Cause that's not, I mean, like A+ in your professional life. Girls, right? Like go.
No
I do not believe in low impact work professionally, but in your personal life, like just be gentle with, you know, your identity and be optimistic that in the long haul, it's all going to work out. And I do think a culture of optimism for women is pretty welcome. And, you know, everyone should go to some Taylor Swift and be happy, you know?
Well, Heather, I want to just thank you so much for your insights. You've shared so much valuable information. And I know these tips are going to empower our listeners to just navigate divorce with some confidence and clarity. And I want to say for these people, these confidant community members who are listening to this podcast, you know, I want to reiterate what you're saying, which is give yourself grace. Mm-hmm. You're not a failure if you stay, and you're not a failure if you leave, right? Like define what happiness looks like for you in this phase of your life. Mm-hmm. And, you know, again, to our listeners, if you are in the midst of considering a separation, you can get support, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, you deserve to protect what you've worked so hard for and to live the life you envision for yourself. So I'm going to just give your information, Heather. So if you want to learn more about Heather Hansen and her work, visit McCarthy Hansen LLP, their website, because, you know, if you need help, again, it's not a crime. It's certainly not a failure if you need to get support, if you need to see a therapist, if you need to, you know, talk to somebody and talk through, you know, what really is going to make sense for you. And on the other side, on the flip side of that, if you're ready to secure your future from any financial setbacks that you might face in your financial life outside of divorce, reach out to us. And really don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, our social media channels for all the latest updates. So thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, Confidant community, see you soon. Thanks again, Heather, for your valuable work here.
My pleasure.
I'm looking forward to another conversation. So you'll see Heather again in the future, folks. Bye, everybody.